Okay, so we'll just go ahead and get started here. I've got a few slides to get through before we get to the meat of the presentation here. But welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today on the last of a 4-crop webinar series introducing folks to University of Minnesota forever green crops that are supported by the state of Minnesota through the Economic and Environmental Clusters of Opportunity Program, or EECO program. And my name is Matt Levitt. I'm an agronomist with the University of Minnesota Forever Green. Here on the call with me from Forever Green as well is Sienna Nesser, the CLC adoption specialist. Also, it's very instrumental in executing the EECO program as well. So I'm going to introduce a little bit of background on the EECO program, and then we're going to hand things over to our presenters here for the rest of the program. So just to give a little background on where we're at, we've had 4 different calls on each of the crops that are supported by this cost share program. We had winter barley and winter camelina last week, Tuesday and Wednesday. And then this week we had Kernza yesterday, and today is hybrid rye to finish things out. We've got Joachim Wiersma, state small grains agronomist specialist with the University of Minnesota, and then Richard Magnuson, who's a grower up in the northern part of the state, has grown hybrid rye for many years to give kind of a on the farm real world experience with growing hybrid rye and economics and such. So all these presentations are recorded. If for whatever reason you want to share them with others, or if you want to rewatch, etc., we're putting them all on our YouTube page, and we can share that with you all if you have an interest. So very quickly, what is EECO? So it's supporting early on-farm adoption of these forever green crops. And if you're not familiar with Forever Green, it is a consortium of university research and development efforts on new and novel crops, perennial and winter annual cropping systems. So the whole goal is to keep brown soil covered, get all the benefits of a continuous living cover cropping system with some economic return at the back end. So it's building soil health, drawing down nitrates, going into groundwater, diversifying our crop rotation, but with some economic pull kind of at the back end. So the Forever Green initiative works both on the, convening the research and development efforts, as well as, working on that market pull on the back end by creating commercialization pathways for those various crops. And really the program is focused on areas of the state that have impaired drinking water, which, in essence is most of the state of Minnesota. But specifically, it offers ecosystem service payments to folks that are interested in trialing these 4 crops that we've been talking about here. And it's based on nitrogen modeling of the individual fields enrolled. And this is a program that is in conjunction with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. So we really want to call them out and thank them for their support of the university. And the map on the right-hand side is the target counties that we're rolling out in the second phase of this program. The first iteration of this program was focused just on Kernza, or intermediate wheatgrass. So the second phase of this program is focusing on the 4 crops: Kernza, winter barley, hybrid rye, and winter camelina across all these counties detailed on the state of Minnesota. Folks located within drinking water management supply areas, all those areas on the map here in yellow, they are eligible for additional payments as well. But certainly if you have anybody or if folks on this call have any interest, definitely would encourage you to get in touch with me and or Sienna to learn more about the program. So the program specifics does fund my position, which is providing agronomic and technical assistance support to growers utilizing these crops. And like I mentioned, there's 2 types of payments. There's the ecosystem service payment, essentially for nitrate drawdown of these particular crops. And then there is almost a rudimentary crop insurance as part of this as well. So if there's a market failure, crop failure, we're paying for half the cost of production of these various crops, as well as seed and grain testing. And our goal is to get 5,000 acres enrolled across the state by 2024. I've got some great interest that's already ongoing. So hopefully you all can learn more about hybrid rye here today as part of that program. So again, if you have any questions about the EECO program specifically, you can sign up online. Feel free to call, email myself or Sienna, and we can get you the information that you need. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Joachim Wiersma to give you all a primer on hybrid winter rye in the state. So you can take it away, Joachim.
Okay, let's see if I can make the technology work the way it's supposed to. So everybody can see the screen?
Looks good. Thank you.
Now let's see if we can get it to advance as well. So very brief history on hybrid rye. Rye is the only outcrossing species in the small grains, and that led two German companies, KWS and Saatenunion, to start working on a hybrid approach about 30 years ago. That because it's an outcrosser, it's a lot easier than doing it with the other small grains like wheat and barley or oats. You may have heard that BASF just shuttered their hybrid wheat program in North America. There have been, attempts to make hybrid wheat probably longer than KWS and Saatenunion have been working on hybrid rye. Hybrid rye, it's still not as easy as corn, because in corn, the male and female parts are separated on the plant in the tassel and the silk. Here, the male and female parts are within the same spike, but we use some genetics to still make hybrids. And this is only probably for me, because I got trained as a plant breeder. This is what basically the breeding scheme looks like. And you can see there's two tracks. And you have to work with restore genes and everything else, but we use male sterility on one side to make hybrid seed. The hybrid seed, when it gets produced, is actually a mixture of the male and the female lines in the whole field. If you've ever seen corn seed production where they're physically separated, that's not the case in this scenario. So advantages. I think we can safely say that under our conditions, we probably have a 30 to 40% commercial heterosis over the open pollinated varieties. And I'll show you the yield data in a little bit. It yields a lot more than the rye you were used to. It's more uniform, which is an outflow in of itself of the hybrid production system. That in of itself already helps with some things, not just managing it and like, when do you harvest, etc. But it also helps with reducing the incidence of ergot. It has, despite being standard height, and normally you would see heterosis for plant height as well. They've done a good job in that it has better agronomics, especially with lodging compared to what we were used to. They're trying to also work on disease resistances. We still have some concerns, for instance, with Fusarium head blight. It's not immune, just like any of the other small grains aren't immune to Fusarium head blight. Now, current acreage, and these numbers are an underestimate, and I'll have Richard talk about it more. What's under contract in Northwest Minnesota with Brooks Grain. There's probably more than 9,000 acres across central and southern Minnesota. There was probably few acres planted than what was intended last fall, because southern Min 2 had a very dry fall, and people were worried that the crop wouldn't come up. We'll get into a little bit more detail about that. Now, and this is an estimate that I've had out for a couple of years. I think there's room for more than 1 million acres. So Matt should be able to set his goal if things work out with 1 million acres. But the assumption there is probably 100 bushel average yield per acre, which is conservative. And a 50% substitution of corn in swine rations. And that really is where I think hybrid rye has to go if we want to have acres, because 1 million acres going into the distilling industry is a very large amount of whiskey. And we can't drink our way out of this problem. Now, There is a chicken and egg conundrum for the swine industry, even though feed equivalency has been well documented. It's a risk and reward for the growers versus the risk and reward for the feed mills. And Paul Greger, I know, is on this, and he's the product manager for Hybrid Rye for KWS in the US. And he's been working very hard with, not just in Minnesota, but across the US with feeders like Smithfield and finishers to integrate rye into swine diets. We don't have, other than now, a regional aggregator in Northwest Minnesota and Thief River, and I'll have Richard talk about that. Having, regional aggregators in Southwest Minnesota, for instance, would greatly help acreage. Now, field selection, it has to be reasonably well drained. We think of rye always as the most drought tolerant, and that's true, but for these really high yields, the crop does need water, so you have to have water holding capacity. Like other small grains, depending on when the flooding happens in the spring with overland flooding, you can see it drown out. We want to avoid known risks, so don't put it on corn ground simply because we want to reduce the risk of Fusarium head blight. And we probably want to avoid really heavily manured fields because eventually you can overfeed it and you'll see lodging. The thing that is getting more complicated is herbicide history. Now that a lot of corn and soybean growers, are relying much more heavily on residual soil active herbicides pre-plant or post-emergence with soil residual activity, we can also run into carryover problems. And that makes it challenging. This is just a couple of examples of rotations of a 3-year rotation. I think winter rye would fit very nicely after soybeans, which doesn't always jive well with where the cover crop industry puts corn, or puts winter rye after corn. But if we look at grain production, I would always put it after soybeans rather than after corn. That herbicide carryover, you'll run into a little bit more problems probably than what the label states as crop rotation restrictions, because it's a fall applied crop, and chemistries and temperature and crop, that's just this 3-way interaction that you now and then get a little bit of surprises when you think you're on the safe side. I've experienced that firsthand. And the interesting thing is then you'll find even that there is differences between different hybrids and open pollinated varieties for susceptibility for basically crop injury to some of these active ingredients. We do have to be very cognizant of what I call the green bridge conundrum. Winter rye is an alternate host for a number of pest and disease problems. Overall, I would say barley yellow dwarf and Hessian fly are probably the biggest at this point in time. And we just have to manage it because we will have winter cereals and spring cereals in the mix across the landscape, depending on where you're at in the state. We really have to pay attention to the green bridge and try to avoid it at all costs. Basic fall agronomics are simple. Seeding rate right now, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million plants per acre. There's a nice trial, and I'll show you a little bit in a little bit, some of the results where we look at this a little bit more in depth. That fly-free date that talks about the green bridge and Hessian fly, I really don't want to start much before September 15th in northern Minnesota. And probably by the time I get to the Iowa border, I want to be in the first week of October. Seeding depth, ideally 1.5 inches, but I'll show you, you can go much deeper. And that weed management, the volunteer grain especially, you want to take out prior to planting and give it enough time that whatever critters are in there, whether it's be aphids or wheat curl mite, have left the premises, so you're not reinfesting that crop right away, that rye crop that is emerging right away. It's a good, even though rye has allelopathic properties, you want to make also sure that you take your winter annuals and your perennials out prior to seeding. Planting depth, like I said, 1.5 inches, quick emergence, good likelihood for optimum seed to soil contact. But rye is much more tolerant, and probably the most tolerant, even more tolerant than oats to deep seeding. This isn't any of the hybrids, but Wheeler, which is indeed a very tall open pollinated variety, has a coleoptile length of 9 inches, which theoretically means you could seed it 9 inches deep. I would never suggest that, but it does indicate that, you know, by the time you get to Ryman, still 6 inches. I think in a fall like we had last fall, I would not be hesitant to go as deep as 3 to 4 inches to seed into moisture. The crop will make it. That seeding rate, you know, you plant earlier, rye will tiller like the dickens. And so one of the first questions that I got as a small grain specialist, well, KWS isn't giving this stuff away for free. Can I get away with a lower seeding rate? Because it's going to tiller anyway. Apart from the greenbrish issue, what is an ideal population? If I plant really, really late, do I need to go higher than the 800,000 plants per acre? And that has to do with tillers. If you have a very short fall or winter comes early or you plant really late, you're going to have fewer tillers initiated in the fall. It will tiller again in the spring. Are fall tillers more productive than spring tillers, etc.? So there's a bunch of really cool questions around this, and there's a multi-state project underway that is trying to answer this. Celeste is the grad student on it. And if you look at the Crookston data, the blue line is which is the earliest planting date. I probably would have called that a flat line rather than the dip that it shows, and that has to do with how you do your statistics. But the earliest planting date, we didn't see a difference between 400,000 seeds and 1.2 million seeds per acre. So that's a flat line. I would expect, and that's what happens. Normally you would see, as you get later, you will see a optimum seeding rate. And so you get this nice bell-shaped curve, and eventually your population might be a little bit too high. And then the green, which is the last planting date, we never reached a high enough population to maximize grain yield. In Custer, Ohio, the lines are a lot flatter than in Crookston. And we'll see again this year if all that holds true. We've learned that the hybrid rye and all ryes are very daylight sensitive, and some of these responses we can probably also explain if we take day length into the consideration, and we might eventually come up with something that you're very familiar with, maturity zones in soybeans, and how you manage your populations and what your seeding rate should be. So, and the next question, of course, is how much fertility does it need? There's a large MDA-funded project underway to basically look at the end recommendations for hybrid rye and look at how much does it need in the fall, how much does it need in the spring. I'm not going to share any results with you because Tara is in the second year of the data, and when we have the recommendations, we'll share it with you. For now, we stick with the top dress application in early spring. And You want to be early because of that daylight sensitivity. That crop has to have a chance to take it up. As far as P and K, stick with the current recommendations. The other nutrients, we really, rye is a very good scavenger. And so there aren't any suggested nutrient needs for any of the minors. I would say probably sulfur would be the first one on very light ground, but I would never put my hybrid rye on the very light soils because of water holding capacity. So we'll skip this for now. Basic summer agronomics, weed management. There is very few options, and that has to do with EPA's risk cup conundrum. Manufacturers have to choose, where they place products, and that has an effect on there's a sum basically of acreage, time, exposure, etc., and that fills up the cup. And once the cup is full, they can't add anything unless they take something out. We're looking for options. There's a herbicide. There's several people having herbicide trials underway, including some of the grass herbicides. And I'll show you a little bit of data. Disease management is pretty straightforward. Look for powdery mildew in the spring, and add heading because rye and hybrid rye is susceptible to Fusarium head blight, and because we're thinking of the swine nutrition being very important in creating acreage, we're going to have to manage Fusarium head blight. Harvest management, basically the same as for any other other small grains. Be aggressive in the south and start harvesting at 18% if you're set up the correct way. So this is a couple of products. Some of you that know chemistries know that Discovery and Vero and Osprey are all grass herbicides. Why look at grass herbicides? It's for the growers in Roseau County to control, for instance, volunteer perennial rye. I would have used it this year if I had a special local needs label to spray out volunteer barley in a trial that I have here on station, because I have Equinox volunteer in my yield trials. So there is some other options. Defender and Elevore are corn products, and that has to do with risk cup and giving growers basically broader options for broadleaf control.
Hey,
This
Yoko,
was, yeah.
Sorry to jump in. We had a question about planting depth. Because I seem to recall that, and maybe Paul can weigh in from KWS about, they had planting recommendations that were like 3/4 of an inch to an inch deep. Do you have any thoughts about that? Like combining that with, 1.5 inches, or is there something? What's kind of the definitive recommendation?
It all depends. You know that is the right answer in agronomy. A lot of that
research is needed, right?
No, I don't think even that much research is needed. It's you got to remember, KWS is a German company, and a lot of the stuff came from Germany. In Germany, where it's not as dry as it is here, and temperatures are milder, and you're further north, 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch is a perfect seeding depth. Here we have to go to 1.5 inches, 1.25 inches for all our other small grains. Rye will pop out of the ground like in no time with those. What I'm saying is that, and I disagree with, and Paul and I can have a little go around on this, I think we can go much deeper, simply of what the Coleoptile can do. Now, would I always recommend that? No, but you want to place the seed in moisture. That seeding rate trial that I have is a failure for me in Crookston because I have depth pans on my plot drill. I can't go deeper than 1.5 inches. And I had basically one planting date laying in dry dirt. And therefore it came up with the third planting date simultaneously because it finally had a shot of rain. And so we can go deeper and it will come up. I am not worried at all that it won't come up, but it has to have moisture to germinate. And there's an interesting observation that I've made is not all hybrids need an equal amount of soil moisture. Some of them are true misers when it comes to the amount of moisture it needs to they need to germinate. Now that's an interesting research project. You know, how dry can the soil be before the individual hybrids don't make it out of the ground?
Got you. Thank you for that.
Okay, so crop safety, this was 2022. The same trial is underway again. It looks like Osprey especially has a little bit of delay in heading and has some crop injury. Now, shorter isn't always worse, but in the, when you start seeing yield losses, maybe it's not the product of choice when you have other options. So spring disease and pest management, like I said, powdery mildew is the biggest one in late April. But when it comes to the hybrids, we have to recognize that the heading application is probably eventually going to be part of the management toolbox. It doesn't mean that we always need it. Escaping Fusarium head blight is a perfectly legit way to manage the disease. And on most years, the rye is early enough that the disease cycle for Fusarium head blight hasn't started up and our risks are relatively low. And so we have to work with the risk models. And if you're not familiar with it, call me and we can discuss.
How susceptible is it compared to like wheat or barley or other like high risk crops?
I liken it very similar to barley in that you don't see the tombstone kernels. You'll see maybe a little bit lighter test weight, but to me it reminds me a lot of what I see in barley, where the deoxyvanol concentration is much more important than the physical loss of bushels. We have to manage deoxyvanol in the swine rations or we have problems. Now, fungicides are important in that if we do it. If you go into the literature, the triazoles, the older triazoles actually reportedly worsen the incidence and severity of ergot. Okay, so now we have competing interests. We're doing trials. There's a couple of trials in Kentucky. I'm doing it for the second year where we look at this to see if we can manage that with the newer DMIs, which include Prizaro, Spherix, and Moravis Ace, which actually has another group of fungicides in it as well. If we looked at Fusarium head blight severity last year, you see numbers that would be comparable to what we would see in wheat or barley, and you can see the yield, the corresponding yield. We didn't have any significant differences. We overall had very low severity with only 7% field severity for Fusarium head blight. We didn't have enough ergot to come to any reasonable conclusion. So the ergot was a non-issue last year. So yield data. Basically, all you have to do is look at the green bar across and compare that to, say, Ryman in the same locations, and that tells you the yield difference and why I am pretty confident to say that we're looking at 30 to 40% commercial heterosis. I think 100 to 130 bushel field averages should be attainable as we refine this the management of these of hybrid winter rye. With that, and this is really to illustrate that when you get to these high yields, you do need nitrogen. If you look at grain protein yield and you say, I'm hauling off 700 pounds of nitrogen of protein per acre, that's more than 100 pounds of nitrogen that I'm removing just in the grain. So you really do have to manage nitrogen to get to these really high yields. Rank stability, the hybrids are on one side. Elbon will always be on the other side. I won't spend more time on this. Agronomic data, the hybrids tend to be a little bit later than some of our earliest, like Elbon. They're middle of the road on the shorter side for plant height, always better lodging scores, and test weight, pretty average for us. The industry likes to see 56 pounds. I think if I would run this over cleaner once, I would very quickly get to 56 pounds. And that's it. Questions?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joachim, for that primer on hybrid rye. Appreciate the time and the effort. In terms of fertility, are you still recommending about, 1.5 pounds of nitrogen per bushel, more or less? Or
yeah, and this has inadvertently happened simply because of the way my trials are set up. These are always co-located with our winter, in most of our locations, with the winter wheat trials. And when I do the backwards calculation, I'm closer to that 1.5 pounds per acre or per bushel for the yield goal. And that it's higher than what the tables are currently saying. And so that's why it's not a formal recommendation, let's put it that way. But if I look at the backwards math in the trials that I've ran over the years, it's a pretty close number. I feel relatively comfortable with that, and that we're probably close to where we should be based on the grain protein content of the harvested grain. If I was truly overshooting it, I would be at 12-13% protein. If I was really undershooting it, I would be probably closer to an 8% grain protein content, and I'm not. I'm closer to 10%, 9 to 10%. So I'm thinking I'm halfway in the ballpark. I'm not completely out in left field. Let's put it that way.
And do you rely on, like soil testing to give you that, like down to 1 foot depth or something like that? Or
yeah, all our trials are in fields where we do have, unless we're east, like in the center, I don't rely on a soil test value. But any west, so if I'm in Roseau, I'm in Crookston, I'm in Lamberton, all those have fall soil test values before we make a fertility program in the fall.
Got you. Yeah, in layman's terms, I know you mentioned the growth stage for over-the-top fungicide application to manage Fusarium head blight. Is that, roughly when people are seeing flowering and pollen shed? Is that kind of what they're aiming for?
So the magic number there is, or the magic code is FEECS 10.51. I can bore you with a whole history lesson on who FEECS was and why it's 10.51. In layman term, it's the beginning of pollen shed. So it's when you start seeing anthers getting extruded, those yellow little tubies hanging out on the middle of the heads. And the first day you see that on some of the earliest headed heads, that's what FEECS 10.5 is. If they're nice and yellow. By the time they're white the next day, you would see yellow ones up above and below those initial white ones. And now you're 2 days into it, and you're basically, pollination is probably 3 days. And if you've never seen it, I encourage you to go out to a rye field, probably right around 6 o'clock in the morning, and it will look like there's a fog hanging over the field. that is actually the pollen that is getting shed right that morning. It does it right around 6 as the sun comes up, and it literally will look like there's a layer of about 2-3 feet above that rye field. It's kind of impressive because it's a lot of pollen if you can see it from a distance.
Cool. And for, again, another question on fertility recommendations, are you taking into account rotational credits, you know?
Yeah.
For,
so if you go to the current recommendations for the University of Minnesota, that all it has previous crop credits all nested in there. And so if you go west of 71, that 1.5, you've basically followed the formula that you would use for spring wheat. Instead of using 2.5, you use 1.5. But there is a soil nitrate test value that you can plug into that formula, as well as a previous crop credit that gets you then to the amount applied. Got
it. Thanks for that. Some inquiring person wants to know what your subscript 2 is too. It's
yeah, it's hidden. I don't know why. I can't change. Oh, sorry. I have to go back now. You have to wait 12 seconds. That was it. So we have to have a 12-second pause to give everybody a chance to start asking questions. Now, for those of you that know me, if you have me in the audience, you never have to worry about that, because I'll generally have a question within the first 3 seconds.
I think with people from the upper Midwest, you could maybe do, you know, add another ×2 to that. So maybe like 30 seconds. Great. Well, really appreciate your time, Joachim. Thanks again for the information. Again, great questions. Feel free to type those into the chat. I'm going to turn things over to Richard Magnuson. Richard, if you don't mind giving us a little kind of geographic orientation about who you are and where you're calling from, and it'd be great to hear from your experience on hybrid rye.
Yeah, just going to get my slides going here. Okay. Yeah, so I'm Richard Magnuson. I farm in Roseau County, right along the Canadian border. You know, I got started with this hybrid rye production. I believe it was about 2015-16. I happened to run into Joachim at the Wheat Grower Convention in November, and Joachim had these rye trials. He was pretty excited about, you know, hybrid rye in the trials and the amazing yields they were doing. You know, he was showing me yields that were 140, 160, just really impressive for small grains. And much less rye has always been, there's been some rye grown up in this neighborhood, but it's always been treated like a poor cousin locked away in the basement, never really managed. And just seeing those yields kind of piqued my interest. And of course, the question I had to ask Joachim was, has anybody put a field of this in northern Minnesota? Does it really yield like Joachim claims in the small plot trials? Because sometimes there is a difference what they can do in small plots versus production fields. So we seeded 60 acres that next fall. Amazingly, first year production was 100 bushels per acre. We had a lot of challenges. We had a thaw in January. We actually had water running in northern Minnesota. We had water ponding in the field and froze in the middle of the field. So we lost an area of the center of the field. But in the end, we were impressed and kind of grew from there, you know, production. So eventually I became a KWS dealer, you know, and distributing the seed in northern Minnesota. Originally, we bought the seed from Albert Lee Seed House, was one of the original KWS dealer in the US, and that's how we got started. So kind of to preface it, I think the first thing, if you're thinking about hybrid rye production, the first thing is to know where your market is. The rye is a relatively small market compared to, you know, spring wheat or even barley. There isn't a lot of natural outlets for it, so you need to know that where it's going to go. You know, not every elevator will buy rye. It's kind of hit and miss where they buy rye. In our area, all the rye production is going for to Brooks Grain and eventually to the millers, distillers. You know, other areas there is opportunities for feed rye, but you need to know your market or where you're going to sell the production before you start planting. In our case, most of it we're no-tilling into a previous crop. Now, the challenge for us is our season's pretty short here. So as Joachim stated, our planting dates in our part of the world, ideal is about September 15th. We don't really want to see anybody planting before September 1st, and probably the end of September is about the latest we can plant up here. So the crops that work best for us that we can actually have out of the way so we can go in and no-till, rye, so canola works well for us. Flax is another crop we've used at times. Spring wheat does work, the timing's right. And soybeans can in our neighborhood. The challenge with soybeans is getting them off in time to plant timely. So we've planted on after all those crops. And this last year, because of our preventive planting, we were so wet last spring, we had ground that didn't get planted the previous year. We ended up seeding on a fair amount of black summerfall last summer. But the big thing with no-tilling into any sort of previous crop is residue management, getting it spread evenly. The challenges we've seen is, especially in wheat is probably the worst, but it can happen in soybeans and canola too. But you don't get a good spread pattern and you'll leave mats of straw that are an inch or two thick. The drill will leave the seed in that mat and it will germinate in the fall. It'll look okay, but then you come back the next spring and they're gone. Because they aren't hooked to the soil good, they don't overwinter well, and they'll consequently won't be there the next year. So the residue management, spreading the straw, doing whatever it takes to get a good uniform seed bed. I would argue a little bit with Joachim on seeding depth. I mean, generally we're seeding around 1 inch. And part of that is that uniformity and quick stand establishment. Again, most of the time moisture isn't a challenge for us here, but again, we want to get it up out of the ground as quick as possible and as uniform as possible. Ideally, this is pictures of plants in beginning of November in northern Minnesota last year. This is kind of where we like to see it going into the fall. We want to see good tiller development, well-established, uniform, across the field. So our seeding date's mid-September. So hybrid seed is a little bit different than, the open pollinated varieties. So the seed is sold by the 1 million pound or 1 million seed viable seeds per unit. So each seed unit has 1 million viable seeds. The cost of seed generally is about $60 an acre in that neighborhood. The recommended seeding rate is 800,000 seeds per acre. And generally, we found that we can actually reduce those seeding rates if we're early enough under good conditions. Again, challenging establishment conditions, we need to be, not be cutting rates, but it's kind of contrary to what we're used to with small grain. Generally, with wheat, especially, we've been pushing seeding rates up, seeing benefits from that, especially with certain varieties. With rye, just some of the experiences we've had locally with guys think more is better. Generally, more isn't better in rye. The tillers stand up well. Under lower population, they're bigger heads. It's actually better standability at lower seeding rates, and we've been able to get some exceptional yields, even as low as 600,000 seeds per acre.
And Richard,
again,
talking about challenging planting conditions, is that mainly just moisture in the field, or?
Yeah, I've got a few slides of what a challenging planting.
Oh, got it. Okay. Carry on.
This is, again, what ideally we'd like to look like going into winter. So just this little bit about fertility. So, kind of on the same page as Joachim as far as fertility rates. The general rate we're using is 1.2 pounds of nitrogen applied per bushel of yield goal, and kind of disregarding whatever's in the soil. Now, the picture I have up here is actually from this spring when we were fertilizing. This field is actually prevented plants, so it was black summerfall last year. Soil tested, it showed about 120 pounds of nitrogen available, more of it in the 6 to 24 inches than in the 0 to 6. Again, the fertility, the nitrogen and sulfur need to get out there really early. And again, In our location, we go from snow melted to spring and overnight almost. So it gets to be a challenge to get out there on time. But so this is a field that soil test shows 120 pounds. We were applying 80 pounds of nitrogen to it. And we have our floater the delay was set wrong on coming out of the headland. So it was turning on too late. So those yellow areas are where it wasn't getting applied early in the spring. I took this picture when it was actually spring, but it's, you know, even with pretty good nitrogen in the background, I was surprised for this to show up that well. You know, I would have never guessed that, you know, we'd show that much of a difference on a summer fallow field. But again, it's the importance of getting out there early, getting it applied. You know, rye takes off so quickly. You know, we were really challenged a year ago when we didn't have a spring. You know, essentially we got to, you know, didn't break dormancy, I think, until mid-May, and then we were jointing almost immediately. And, you know, talking to EECO, that goes back to that day-like length reaction it has. And just, you know, when it gets late like that, it goes to joining, and you want it on before it starts joining. So, and if you do put fertility on late, you'll struggle with wheel tracks. You know, the floaters will leave tracks, and and that creates problems during pollination. So again, early is key. So in the fall of 2020, we were no-tilling. This is actually a seed production field. We were no-tilling into canola, very dry ground. You know, it hadn't rained for 2-3 months. You know, I don't think we could have put it in deep enough to find moisture, you know, in reality, or been able to put the drill in deep enough to find it. We seeded it at about 1 inch, or probably actually 1.5 inches. Still didn't find moisture. Didn't get rain. It was seeded timely, but we didn't get rain. I think it was until October 5th. And then unusually cold October. The ground actually froze about the 20th of October, which even for us is early. So this is pictures of the field taken in the first in April, and then the second, I don't know if it shows up on your screens, but the second one was a month later, about the 4th of May. You know, if you look really hard, you can see rows, but not much, but there is signs of life out there. Now this field probably, if it would have been a commercial field, we may have abandoned it quicker because it was seed production. We held on to it, and you know, just it was a year where we had a really early spring, an extended period, you know, long period for it to tiller and, you know, vegetative growth. So it was working in our favor. You know, the spring of 22 would have been a night and day difference. I don't think it would ever have recovered like it did in 21, but rye has an amazing ability to recover. The thing about this field, the Coleoptile actually never got above the surface in the fall. The kernel germinated, and it's still vernalized anyway. And Joachim could talk more about that, how that happens. But so really no sign of life in the fall, very little sign of life in the spring. Again, this is a picture of it a month later. You know, you're starting to be able to see rows. And then we took it all the way to harvest. And so in harvest, normally we straight cut, but we had some weed issues here, so we swathed it, but it'll show the yield. This still ran about 90 bushels per acre, even after all those challenges. You know, you saw it going in, but you know, we fertilized it as soon as we could. You know, got timely rains to get the fertilizer washed in. You know, that is kind of one of the challenges with rye in the spring. You know, you have to surface apply the nitrogen. There really isn't a good way to put the nitrogen in the soil. Maybe with, you know, 28% or liquids would be a little bit better, but so you need to get it out there, hopefully get a rain to get it washed in the soil. You know, agrotane or, you know, nitrogen inhibitors are helpful, you know, depending on the rain. So that can be an issue, is being able to it's one thing to get it out there. It's the next thing is to get it actually available into the ground, available to the plants. So this is a photo of a sample, but the thing we're concerned about is where I've got my pointer. That's an ergot body. There's another one in the lower left-hand corner. We want it to pollinate as uniformly as possible, all at the same time. Now, the biggest enemy, at least in our area, is water in the fall. So if you get ponding water in the fall, you'll get drowned out areas. And, you know, the plants that die, that's probably less of a problem than the ones on the edges that get set back and they'll pollinate later. And those later pollinators will be full of ergot. So everything we do, we're trying to get it to pollinate as uniformly as possible. So here's a little bit of a blow up of what ergot looks like. This is actually the rye kernel, and these are the various ergot bodies you'll find in a sample. So, you know, some of them are like 3, 4 times as big as an ergot. Sometimes they're, you know, half or of the rye kernel. Sometimes they're half the size. So, and there really isn't, you know, avoidance is about the only mechanism for control.
Richard, can I chime in quick?
Sure.
So ergot bodies like this, one management tactic, and it's a double-edged sword. If you leave it stand long enough, the rye, and this is where straw strength becomes important, the ergot will shatter way before the grain will shatter. Ergot in of itself doesn't, the bodies itself are not, they're like a sclerotia and white mold. However, their longevity is a lot shorter. So having it fall to the surface is a way to manage ergot.
Okay. The other thing in general, ergot, so essentially when rye starts pollinating, it's kind of a race to the flower. If the ergot gets there before pollen, you'll form an ergot body. If pollen gets there before the ergot, then you're safe from ergot. Once the flower is pollinated, ergot won't develop after it's pollinated. So that's why that bloom period is so important, you know, the other thing, you know, and under the worst case scenario, we have seen fields in this area that the ergot has been 1% to 2%. And it came in a wet fall, lots of drowned out areas. The farmer kept the field. Just there was so much ergot around those water holes, and that's another thing when harvesting. If you do have those, the best thing is to avoid those areas when you're harvesting. Harvest them separate. Don't mix them in with the main lot. You know, the main part of the field might be okay, but if you mix those, you know, edges or anywhere the pollination was delayed in, you're going to get to a point that it's unmarketable. So in general, the marketplace only accepts up to 0.3% ergot. Even at 0.3, it's subject to discount, but it's still acceptable. But the thing, once you go over that, it isn't even good for livestock feed for the most part. So to get on those high ergot lots that we've seen, we've had to have them cleaned to get them down to market specs. And sometimes that can be done, you know, as easily with air screen machines and fairly gravity tables. Sometimes it's taking color sorters to get those levels down.
And Richard, looks like you're swathing and picking it up with a pickup head. Is that right? Not straight cutting it?
I'll have another slide later, but generally, so part of this, back to Joachim's point, is leaving it standing. We're concerned about falling numbers, and you know, falling numbers are affected by, you know, initial germination in the field or rain during harvest. So we're really leery of swathing anything. That field I showed you was kind of a special case. We had a lot of canola, volunteer canola that came late. Just there was no kind of way around. We had to swat it just to be able to get it through the combines. You know, we looked for a window of weather where we weren't worried about rain, and you know, swathed it, let it lay 3 days, and picked it back up. But normally we don't like to swath. Just again, worried about falling numbers, degradation. The good thing about the hybrid rye, they're head and shoulders in falling numbers above the OP varieties. You know, these probably start out at almost 300 falling numbers, where open pollinated varieties are maybe a shade over 200. So they've got some room to go down. But for the milling distilling market, it's all about falling numbers. They need high falling numbers. If it starts to sprout and those falling numbers go down, they don't want it. Few other things that can kind of this happened again in spring of 2021. The rye fields were generally pretty early. We had a frost in late May, so it caught some parts of the field in the wrong stage, and you'll on the right you'll see the white heads or white parts of heads, and that's basically they're sterile from the frost. The other picture on the left was actually taken in the same field, but those plants were in a little bit different stage when the frost came. So it's not often we see that, but it can happen. And partly I think because we were so dry, it was a lot easier for the temperatures to really cool down. And at the same time, we had beans that were emerged that froze out too that we had to replant. So it was not that never happens, but it can happen, but it's rare. So this is where rye in northern Minnesota is right now. We're in the midst of pollination. As Joachim said, when it pollinates, it's a white cloud out there early in the mornings, and that's ideally what we want to see. Ton of pollen shed, all the plants in that same stage at the same time. That's going to give us our highest yields and least chance of ergot. And then I've got one more short video here of this is actually from might have been 2019, but we had some good rye fields that year. We're combining, this rye is running about 130 bushels per acre. We're cutting 40 feet. It puts quite a load on the combine. And it seems like it's always a little bit of a challenge to get rye dried down completely. The stem tends to stay green, and which makes a lot of work out for the combine. We tend to take it, we'll straight cut like this. We'll take it wet, either put it in aerated storage, or we'll actually dry it. Just, again, we're concerned about maintaining quality. So that's kind of what I have. Be open to questions, I guess. And
Awesome. Thank you so much, Richard. Really appreciate that. It's great to see the videos too, kind of really grounds it, in the scale that you're farming this at. You were talking about residue management previous to seeding. What are you doing to kind of do that? Do you have a kind of a residue spreader, chaff spreader? How's that happening before you're seeding your rye?
So the first step is doing as much with the combine as we can. Making sure that the straw chopper chaff spreaders are doing their job, spreading it out to the width where the header or the swaths, depending if we're picking up the swaths. But that's always the most important first step, is what the combine's doing. Sometimes you just can't do enough there, so we'll either use a harrow and go diagonally across the field, to help spread the straw. A super coulter sometimes do that, but just if it isn't uniform, you've got to do something to make it uniform. And again, if it's spring wheat and you're baling the straw off, it's probably not as much of a concern as long as your chaff's getting spread out.
Gotcha. And I saw you were in that harvest video, you were at like 17 some odd percent. What's your target moisture to dry down with air? Are you aiming for that 13 to 12% or drier? Or?
We need to get it to 13 is kind of the official standard, but they will accept up to 13.5.
Okay. And that's just with air, not with heat, correct?
We've done both, but you can do it with air. Kind of depends on conditions and then how fast you need to get back out of the bin. So
okay. So for seed, the low level heat isn't as big of an issue then, or is this for hauling to Brooks?
The commercial, that's less of a concern because you don't have to worry about the germination.
Sure. Yep.
With seed production, obviously we're concerned about it. We have used heat, but it's probably not over 90 degrees.
Got it. Well, great. Well, we're about at noon. I want to say again, thank you to Joachim, Richard, for your time and presentation. And again, to all the folks on, appreciate you joining us here today. We will be recording these presentations and throw them up on YouTube. And again, if you have any questions about hybrid rye, you've got Joachim's contact, you've got myself and Sienna's contact. And again, if you have any further questions on EECO, the program that's sponsoring this, do let us know. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Take care.